Do the tools you're using at the gym matter if you're trying to build muscle? Meaning, does it matter if you use bands? Does it matter if you use machines? Does it matter if you use free weights? Or is it all kind of one and the same as it relates to trying to build muscle? On today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, Julie and I are going to explore this question and dive into what you should be considering when it comes to using different pieces of equipment and different tools if building muscle is one of your goals with your exercise. We're going to cue the intro song and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Charlie. Before we dive into this week's episode, I want to let you know that we recently released a book called The Exercise for Life Method. And if you enjoy the conversations that we have every single week on this podcast, then you are going to love this book. So to pick up a free copy of this book, all you have to do is go to exerciseforlifemethod.com. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise that's geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. Now, before we get into this week's episode, we want to take a second and say thank you to everybody who is listening to the Exercise is Health podcast. We appreciate it. This podcast has grown by leaps and bounds, and so many of you have taken the time to share your thoughts with us on Apple Podcasts. And so we want to highlight a review that we recently received about our podcast.
So check this out. It says, Charlie, Julie, and their incredibly knowledgeable guests talk all things exercise, but it's so much more than that. You'll get tons of actionable advice and tangible tips, but you'll also get heaps of inspiration from truly engaging individuals that genuinely want to help others. Thank you so much for putting out such a spectacular show, guys. Keep up the great work. So as we've been building this community of exercisers, we have really enjoyed hearing back from you guys because it lets us know that we are accomplishing our goal. It gives us feedback. So if you are new to this community, a veteran to this community, please go on to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. And you never know, your rating and review might be shared here on the podcast live.
Now, during today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we're exploring this question of, does it matter what tools you use when you're exercising if your goal is to build muscle? And a number of people have the goal of building muscle, and this can range from trying to build muscle for physique reasons, for sports performance reasons, or simply for health reasons. And obviously our focus here at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, as well as on the Exercise is Health podcast, is exercising for health, and building muscle is a component of that. So we want to explore this question and start to look at different tools that can be used and discuss, well, does it even matter whether you use bands, whether you use machines, whether you use free weights, whether you use cables? Like, does it matter at all? And if so, why? And if not, why not? So stay tuned, because if building muscle is of interest to you, especially from a health perspective, we have some information you are definitely going to want to hear.
You know, the other week I was working with a client and she comes in and she also works out at home, and she said, could you help me with some band exercises for home because bands are really the best for me? And it was an interesting statement because I thought, well, are bands really the best for you, or are they just what you have at home and they're convenient? Those are two different statements. The bands are really convenient for me, or the bands are best for me. Or you might find, oh, I really love band exercises because they're the only ones that don't hurt, or they're the only ones that don't flare me up. But we can apply any tool. And a lot of the common tools that we know about in the gym that you've probably heard about are bands, free weights, machines, and body weight, which means just no weight, just use your body. Now, it's very important that we look at the vernacular or the words that we use around stuff, because that is what shapes the picture in our head of what it really does. So, for example, my client thinking that bands were the best for her when really they were just actually the most convenient for her because that's what she had at home. Or, free weights are more functional, so it improves my function more. So we label these things a lot of different ways, and it's important that we really look at, well, what do we actually have to do with any tool in the gym to produce these muscle building and muscle health changes that we're looking for? Now, today we're not going to specifically dive into why is it important to build muscle. We have many podcasts about that, but we're going to talk more about knowing about the tools, because if you look at your exercise, many people are very biased towards certain tools because of our comfort level or, again, convenience, what we have available. So today will be a cool podcast to reflect on your own workouts. Are you biased towards one way, biased towards the other way, and kind of knowing, what do I really need to seek out with any tool when I'm working out in the gym, and what are some considerations when we're thinking about the different tools?
So here's the thing when choosing your tools and the results you get from your workouts. Regardless of the tools that you use, when it comes to building muscle, if the exercise doesn't challenge you, if it doesn't fatigue you, it's not going to change you. And that is super true, especially when it comes to building muscle. So as much as we like to get caught up in the magic of this machine or the magic of the bands or the magic of the free weights or whatever, there's no magic involved. There's none whatsoever. The only thing that truly matters is, can I make this challenging enough to my body to get to a high enough level of fatigue to then actually get my body to change? That's really it. Now, here's the thing. Why this matters is because if you're at a gym and you have, machines that have large weight stacks and you have free weights with, a whole bunch of plates or whatever, it's pretty easy to make it challenging enough for you, to the point where you get really fatigued. That's not that hard. What gets more difficult is when we're just looking at body weight, when we're just looking at bands or something like that. That can be, for some people, more difficult to make really, really challenging, depending on your strength level, depending on your conditioning level, and depending, quite frankly, on how long you want to be doing an exercise for. Look, even the people who can do the most push-ups in the world, eventually they get fatigued, but it might be after 100, 150, 200 push-ups, right? So it's how much time do I really want to spend doing this thing? So these are all considerations that you need to keep in mind when thinking about, well, okay, my goal is to build muscle. Do I go to the tools that seem most magical, or do I go to the tools that are actually going to challenge my body the most? And if your goal is building muscle, then it's the latter. You want to go towards the tools that are going to provide the most challenge for you.
Charlie, that is definitely the bottom line. You have to use whatever tools you have to take yourself to that very challenging, meaning a lot of stimulus level. And a lot of people don't use their tools in that manner. So whatever tool you're using, body weight, bands, dumbbells or free weights or machines, think about, how can I take this to a level that is fatiguing? And I want to say in that moment, meaning, remember, Charlie and I are very particular about making sure your body stays healthy, functioning well while you're doing it. So considering all those things, can I make it as fatiguing as possible without compromising the health and function of my body? That's what we're looking for. So in my opinion, and what I've been exposed to, some of the easiest ways to do that is by going to a gym and using machines and using free weights. Because every client I've talked to, they've said, well, I have a home gym and I have, some 3-pounders, which for most people, 3 pounds is going to take about 1 billion reps to get to fatigue. And I have this yellow band, or I've got 3 yellow bands. And if you're not really that well versed on bands, no problem. Yellow is usually the lightest band ever. And then I have some TheraBands from therapy. What kind of workouts can I do? So that's the thing. When we have tools, we always have to think, how can I make each exercise, when appropriate, go to a momentary failure or very fatigued? And the easiest way, again, to do that is probably going to be dumbbells and free weights and machines. And I'm not saying you can't do it with the other things, but there is definitely some limits when you get to the other tools. So we can jump to, again, bands. You got to think, how can I take my bands and make them challenging? Can I double up bands? Or I got thicker bands? What can I do to make sure that my muscles are getting that massive amount of stimulus that I need to create these health benefiting changes? Now, body weight's pretty interesting. Unless you've really studied mechanics, body weight, in my opinion, is either like way too much or way too little. If you think about push-ups, I'm sure some of you listening to this podcast think like, I can't do a traditional push-up on my toes and hands. And that means that the challenge of a push-up is already too much for what you can do. Or if you go on your knees, then it becomes too light. Or you can think about another body weight exercise like pull-ups. I can't even do a pull-up right now. There was a time in my life when I could, and I'd max out at 3 reps. And some people can do 50 pull-ups. So the thing with body weight is that it's generally very biased, and you have to be kind of skilled at figuring out how to make this appropriately challenging so that I can do the exercises and still get the health benefits without them being all too hard or all too easy. So that is the burden that we all have as an exerciser, is going through and figuring out what things do I have available to me that I can make challenging and appropriately challenging no matter what tool I'm using, and bias my tools to different exercises and bias my tools to other different exercises so that I can be accomplishing this I need to make each exercise challenging goal.
Julie, that is right on. And if you're listening to that and in your mind, you're thinking something along the lines of, oh, I knew dumbbells were better. I knew that bands weren't as good. Like if you're walking away from what Julie just said with that, I want to say pause for a second and either go back and re-listen or listen to what I'm about to tell you, because that's not the case. We're not saying better or worse. What we're saying is what is going to allow you a greater opportunity to create an appropriate challenge for your body. Because here's the thing. As much as some people love dumbbells and think that they're super functional, and when it comes to building muscle, if we're talking about it's about the challenge, the way most people lift dumbbells they do so in a way that's actually not that challenging for their body. In fact, the entire time they're trying to lift the dumbbell, they're trying to make it as little of a challenge for their body as possible, which when it comes to building muscle is the exact opposite thing that you want to do. So it's really not about the tool. And that's what we hope you walk away from this conversation with. It has nothing to do with the tool. It has everything to do with how much challenge the tool creates for your body. And that has to do with how you go about doing the exercise, okay? And so the reason why Julie's saying, well, some people will come in and they'll say, well, I have my 3-pound weights and I have my TheraBands and I have my yellow bands. What can I do at home to build muscle? The challenge with that, the difficulty with that is most people's know-how of how to make things really challenging for themselves, and then their willingness to continue to make things challenging for themselves, which is what is necessary in order to be able to build muscle, is just not there. It's not that it's not learnable. It certainly can be, but it is because it's just not there. It's easier to say, well, instead of lifting the 3 pounds, let's go to the 10 pounds, because you're going to try to make it easier for yourself anyway. So at least let's start from a place that's harder, start from a place that has more challenge, and then we can go from there. So it gives us a better shot right off the bat. So that's the premise of why Julie positioned those things that way. It's not that you can't build muscle with 3-pound dumbbells. It's not that you can't build muscle with TheraBands or yellow bands or whatever, but it's about how you go about doing it and being willing to continue to challenge yourself with your exercise in order to be able to build muscle. So I wanted to throw that in there because a lot of times, especially when it comes to certain tools, we get on teams, right? Oh, I'm team body weight. You see the gymnasts, they have so much muscle. Well, they only do body weight. So I'm only doing body weight. It's yeah, the gymnasts are really good at challenging their bodies. They're also really good at not challenging their bodies, which is why they're able to do all these acrobatic stuff and make it look relatively effortless. They're incredibly skilled at making things not that challenging for their bodies. But in order to actually get their bodies to adapt, they had to make stuff challenging. And most people aren't either aware that they need to do that, or if they are aware, they're not willing to do it. They're not willing to kind of lean into the fact that, yeah, this exercise really burns right now. I should keep going with that, as opposed to, how can I compensate to make it easier?
Charlie, you brought up two really good points here. One, which I just want to restate because it was so good, and then one that I want to talk about a little bit more. The first one being that we do get on these teams of like, I'm team machine, I'm team bodyweight, I'm team whatever. And it's important to just acknowledge like, yeah, I'm biased towards this. And whether that means that you acknowledge it and then you start exploring more, or you acknowledge it and see the benefits and limitations of being on that team, it's fine. We're not here to tell you what team to be on, because I think what team you're on has a lot to do with your past experiences, what you're doing right now, what's convenient, what's available, what you feel comfortable doing, what tool you maybe have more skills in using. Like, let's face it, the first day that you do dumbbells, you're not going to have much skills doing that. But if you've been using dumbbells for 10 years, you're going to be a lot more skilled at using it than you did on day one. And so you might know how to make it feel good and how to make more options and more variations to body match using dumbbells than another tool that you haven't really played with a lot. So there is valid points of why you might be on a certain team. But every team has its limitations, so we also invite you to explore other ones. Now, Charlie, the other spicy topic that you said that we see all the time, and it just is that people struggle, I struggle, to have the willingness to take yourself to a certain level of challenge. So much in the exercise industry, we're taught that any exercise is good, and as long as you do it, that's good. And yes, we want you to exercise. And if you're exercising and doing whatever, we'd rather you doing whatever than doing nothing. We want you moving. We want you. But if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably hungry for more details on how to be more specific, how to be more strategic, how to be more focused, how to be more health promoting with your exercise. You're not here just to like sign up for a random class that you just do and you don't think about stuff. That's not our community. And so when we're thinking about using our tools, we have to also do a self-check. Like, hey, am I willing to take myself to a level of fatigue? And now there is some discomfort that comes along with that level of fatigue. And you might know people, or it might be you, that really likes that discomfort. Like you crave that, like, that muscle burn or that feeling of that big effort, that fatigue. You might also be on the other side of the spectrum where you're like, I don't really like that feeling. Like, that's not my jam. That's not for me. It doesn't matter if you like it or you don't, but your willingness to do it is what is going to create the change, or your unwillingness to do it is what's going to prohibit you from getting the maximum amount of results from the gym. Now, when you're approaching this willingness to do it, there is some like vulnerability with that. Like when you're exercising and you're coming up, you're saying, okay, Julie and Charlie say I need to take this exercise to, a big effort, maximum amount of effort. So maybe you're sitting on the chest press machine and you're getting pretty darn tired. I want you to test the last few reps. It's like, can I do another rep, keeping all my form parameters, what's moving, what's not moving? What's going to happen if I do the next rep? Am I going to feel okay tomorrow? I mean, I've taken myself to this level before and I did fine. So is there another level? And sometimes we don't even know what levels are next. It's like we have this certain amount of that was hard, in quotes, and we stop when it's at that level of that was hard. But we don't really know, well, what is my maximum? What is close to my maximum? What is the next level of difficulty or hard?
One of the neatest changes I see a lot of clients make as they work with us for an extended period of time is understanding their own physical limits. And it's, almost across the board, every time somebody starts coming in, their perception of what feels challenging is dramatically under what is actually challenging for them. Because if you're not used to exercising, that means for the most part, your body is pretty much used to being at rest, in one way or another. So anything above rest feels like a challenge, right? But it doesn't mean that you're actually near your capacity of what your body can actually do. And so what's so interesting is when you first start off, your body's going to start saying, well, wait a second, we're used to being in this rested state. We don't really like all this extra stress. we don't really like having to do all this extra stuff. So your brain is going to start telling you, wait a second, no, this is, you're nearing your max. Yeah, you're nearing your max. I know you just started, but you're nearing your max. You're getting close to as much as you can do. You shouldn't push it any further because, we want to go back to that rested state. And when we start, we listen to that because that's all we know, right? Like we don't understand that we have the ability to kind of push through that. But over time, what's really cool is your brain starts to calm down a little bit. And what it starts to tell you is not like, oh my gosh, you need to stop right now, but like, oh yeah, the last time we did this, we survived and we did all right after. And we weren't like achy or beat up or sore or anything. We did okay. So, I think you can go a little farther. I think you can push a little more. I think you can do a little bit more weight. And so we start to explore that. And you can see with clients over, months and years, just how their interpretation of like actually how fatigued their body is completely changes. And yeah, they get stronger, they get in better condition. So that's part of it too. But it's just the understanding of yourself, of like actually how far you can push yourself before your body starts saying, yeah, you know what, this actually is my limit for today. Like we actually shouldn't go any further, as opposed to your brain jumping in and saying, you know what, you're safest on the couch. So why don't we just stop right now and go back to the couch? Because this leg press that you're doing, it's really, making your muscles burn, and that could be a threat. So, we should just stop right now. You get past that and you're able to explore, oh yeah, no, I can actually do a little more.
It's like your subconscious brain and the media about fitness are on the same team. Like, this is kind of hard, but, you did something. Check it off the to-do list. And, Charlie and I aren't really here to stroke your ego, but we're trying to give you some tactical things to help you change. Now, everyone's perception of difficulty is different, I think. And I think Charlie hit the nail on the head when he said that what most people perceive as challenging when they first start exercising and what is actually challenging for their body are two different things, because we have your muscles getting challenged and then we have your brain that has to dictate and direct your body, and your brain's like, what the is going on? So I think it's interesting. There are some ways to interpret what you're going through to know if you actually got to this big effort, no matter what tool you're using. Remember, you can do this with any tool. Now, every tool has its intricacies of how to play with them, but you can use any tool and take it to this max effort. I want to give you examples of two different clients, because as a trainer, what's interesting is I don't think clients usually think of this, or people that aren't trainers think of this, but as trainers, we never get to feel what you feel. Like, you think a lot of people think that the experience that you have when you exercise is universal. And it's actually not. And so we're constantly on the outside of your body watching you exercise and trying to figure out, should we do more? Is there more in there? Is it more weight? Is it more reps? Or are we done? Are we doing isometrics now? I don't know. So we're constantly looking at people from the outside. So I want to tell you two different client stories. So I used to train this client, and he would be very focused when he exercised. I loved it because I could ask, okay, what's happening there? He would tell me, okay, do we need more? Do we need to stop that? So all the details that I needed, I would always get from him. And he would just be focused. He had to close his eyes, be thinking about his body. It was great. And then when we were done with the exercise, no matter what the weight was, he would go, oh my gosh, that was hard. And again, it didn't matter because I would keep notes on his weights, if we were doing 50% or if we were doing the full effort. So what I learned with this client was that every stimulation and every set he thought was hard. And it was probably a combination of the actual weight and doing the exercise, and also his level of intention and focus. As I told you, he was very focused. He was very internal, which was great. So we often had to make adjustments off of how he felt the next day. Like, was he feeling great and awesome the next day? Then we know we did something really appropriate. So we were trying to play with what was happening in the session because everything was difficult for him in his perception. Versus, I've had other clients and we'll be doing the warm-up set. And after we do the warm-up set, which usually can be a little bit harder because your body is just getting warmed up, but we'll do a lighter set and they'll say, oh yeah, this is pretty hard. And mostly because they have an opposition from going to heavy weights. They think, well, there's a lot of weight on there right now. I don't know, Julie picked my weight. That probably means it's hard because she's a trainer and trainers always pick hard weights. So it's probably hard, you know? And then the next day they feel nothing, which is fine. I mean, you shouldn't feel negativeness, but it also shows us, okay, I don't know, did we get to a close level of fatigue? And so some people feel like in the moment, they're like, yeah, I can do more, or yeah, it's hard. And then the following day, we get some information that we didn't otherwise have, that we wouldn't have otherwise known, whether they're sore, which means we did too much, or if they feel nothing, it could be an indication that we were way too low. So it's always a playfulness here of like, how much challenge can we do? I like what Charlie said, this willingness to challenge yourself, because that is like a definitely psychological state. Am I ready to do this event? So apply this to every tool. Again, making sure that you're figuring out, am I willing to take this to a challenging level, or is this a yellow band? It's going to take me 3 hours to get to a challenging level. But remembering that big piece, you've got to take yourself to fatigue.
So when it comes to building muscle, it's not really about the tool that you're using. It's not whether you are using a machine or whether you're using free weights or cables or bands or body weight. That is less of an importance versus how much challenge does the exercise provide your body, and how challenging are you willing to make the exercise? Are you willing to do the 3-pound weights if 3-pound weights feel really light for you until you get to a point of extreme fatigue? Or are you just wanting to do 15 reps and, however much fatigue you end at 15 reps, and that's where you end? You have to be willing to challenge yourself with your exercise if your goal is to build muscle. This does not mean that you need to be achy, beat up, and sore after your workouts. This does not mean that you need to create muscle damage with your workouts. In fact, creating muscle damage will reduce your ability to build muscle. But within what is appropriate for you, you need to be willing to challenge yourself. Now, there are some other specific considerations when it comes to building muscle, and different tools can have different influences on those specific considerations, but that is a bit outside of the scope of today's conversation. So in later episodes, we will explore kind of other things that come along with building muscle and other things you need to consider. But for today, what we want you to leave this conversation with is, don't get so caught up on the tool. Whatever tool you use, be willing to challenge yourself with it. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that is interested in building muscle and they find themselves either not sure what tools they should use in order to build muscle, or strongly on one team when it comes to the tools that they're using in order to build muscle? Share this episode with them so they can hear our perspective on what considerations they should be taking when it comes to choosing different tools and performing different exercises in order to build muscle. And while you're online, if you wouldn't mind, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. So how'd you like that episode? Did you find the information useful? If you enjoyed what we discussed today, then you are going to love the Exercise for Life Method, which is a book that we just put out and you can get a free copy of by going to exerciseforlifemethod.com. All we ask is that you pay for shipping and handling, so head there now and get your free copy, as well as some exclusive bonuses that you will get instant access to when you get the book. You can learn more and get your copy at exerciseforlifemethod.com. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.